Okay, so ready to dive into something pretty heavy. Mental causation. We know our listeners would be philosophers, so we went with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, their entry on mental causation, and, well, let me tell you, it's a lot.
Yeah, a deceptively simple concept at first glance until you start pulling on that thread, and then the whole, I don't know, the whole sweater of philosophy kind of unravels.
Right. So what we're trying to do today is really get down into the weeds. I mean, like in the nitty-gritty. So we're going to look at all of the arguments, the counter-arguments. This is not mental causation for dummies.
Not at all. This is a deep dive for philosophers, by philosophers.
And as a philosopher, the first question you might be asking is, why do I even care about mental causation?
Well, think about it. If our minds can't cause things to happen in the world, if our beliefs and desires aren't actually driving our actions, what does that mean for us as agents?
Yeah. I mean, it's more than just like choosing pizza for dinner. It's literally the foundation of agency.
Exactly. It's about free will, moral responsibility, the very possibility of acting intentionally. And the implications go way beyond our individual choices. It affects how we think about ethics, law, even science itself.
Because if our thoughts aren't really guiding our actions or our inquiries, then what's left? Are we all just puppets of our brain chemistry?
Right. And where does that leave things like moral responsibility? If my actions are just the result of physical processes in my brain, can I really be held accountable for them?
So yeah, I mean, it seems like everything we value as philosophers is somehow tied up with this idea of mental causation.
Yeah.
So how did this problem even come about? When did it dawn on philosophers that this thing we take for granted, our minds causing our actions, is actually a really hard problem?
A lot of it can be traced back to Descartes, the I think, therefore I am guy. He's the one who really set us down this path with his whole substance dualism thing.
Right, the mind-body split. But it's not just that he separated the mind and body, it's that he insisted they could interact. And that's where things start to get really messy.
For sure. I mean, if the mind is this non-physical, immaterial thing, how on earth can it possibly interact with the physical world? How can a thought, which doesn't take up any space, make my arm move?
That's a question that puzzled even Descartes' contemporaries. Like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia had famously challenged him on this very point.
Yeah.
She just couldn't wrap her head around how an immaterial soul could possibly bump into a physical body and make things happen.
And she wasn't the only one. This whole problem of interaction, it's been a huge stumbling block for substance dualism ever since. Philosophers have spent centuries trying to find that missing link, that nexus that could bridge the gap between mind and body.
So besides this general problem of how the heck a non-physical mind can make anything happen in the physical world, what are some of the other challenges that substance dualism faces when it comes to mental causation?
Well, one tricky issue is the pairing problem. Let's say, just for argument's sake, that we can somehow get an immaterial soul to interact with a physical body. How do we explain why this particular soul gets paired with this particular body?
Yeah, that's a good point. If souls are nine-spatial, as Descartes claimed, then it's not like they have a specific location that could be matched up with a body's location.
Right. It would be like trying to fit together two jigsaw puzzles, but one of the puzzles is invisible. You wouldn't even know where to begin. And then on top of that, you have cases like identical twins who share a lot of their physical makeup, but presumably have different souls.
And let's not forget about those thought experiments where philosophers love to swap minds between bodies. Substance dualism just doesn't seem equipped to handle those kinds of scenarios.
Not really, no. And then there's another problem that comes from the laws of physics, the whole conservation of energy thing. If the mind is non-physical, how can it inject new energy into a physical system?
So if my decision to get up and grab another cup of coffee is caused by my immaterial mind, that means some spooky non-physical energy is somehow making my body move, right?
Exactly. And that seems to violate a pretty fundamental law of physics.
Right. Like, it's like substance dualists are proposing a perpetual motion machine for the mind. It's somehow creating energy out of thin air.
It does kind of sound that way, yeah. And as if those problems weren't bad enough, substance dualism also runs up against what's called the completeness of the physical problem. It's this idea that basically every physical event has a complete physical cause.
So if we could trace the chain of physical causes and effects back far enough, we'd eventually arrive at a complete explanation for why anything happened without ever having to appeal to any non-physical causes.
That's the basic idea. And if that's true, then it doesn't seem to leave much room for mental causation, does it? It's like physics is saying, we've got this covered, thanks, no need for any spooky mental stuff.
It seems like the more we learn about the brain, the less we need the mind to explain what's going on.
That's one way to look at it. Now, I know there are some philosophers out there who are still holding on to substance dualism, and they might say that we need to rethink our understanding of the physical world or maybe even the nature of causation itself.
So maybe there's a way to tweak our metaphysics or our physics to make room for a non-physical mind that can somehow interact with the physical world.
That's the hope. But these revamped versions of substance dualism tend to be pretty radical. They often require some pretty big departures from our standard scientific understanding of things.
It sounds like they're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, bending over backwards to make substance dualism compatible with what we know about the world.
You could definitely say that. And while I admire the effort, it's safe to say that most philosophers these days have moved on from substance dualism as a way to make sense of mental causation.
Okay, so if substance dualism is a dead end, where do we go from here? Do we just give up and say that mental causation is an unsolvable mystery?
Not at all. In fact, by moving away from this idea of an immaterial soul, we open up a whole new set of possibilities for how the mind might be able to cause things to happen.
This is where things start to get really interesting. Because most philosophers today accept some form of physicalism, so we're not talking about spooky souls anymore. But the problem of mental causation doesn't just disappear, does it?
It definitely doesn't. It just takes on a different and maybe even more challenging form. The question becomes, how can mental properties, beliefs, desires, intentions have any causal power in a world that is ultimately physical?
So it's less about how a ghost can push a shopping cart and more about how the thought of going to the store can actually get me to, walk out the door.
Exactly. We know our brains cause our bodies to move, but the question is whether those movements happen because of our mental states as mental, not just as physical events happening in the brain. That's a subtle but really crucial distinction.
It is, and I think it's a good reminder that even within a physicalist framework, there are still some pretty profound philosophical puzzles to grapple with when it comes to mental causation.
Oh, absolutely. The problem doesn't get any easier just because we accept that the mind is physical. In fact, some might say it gets even harder.
All right, let's hear it. Let's get into these next-level mental causation puzzles.
So one of the biggest challenges for mental causation, at least when we're working within a physicalist framework, is this thing called the exclusion problem. It's this tricky question of how mental properties can actually be causally effective if every physical event already has a complete physical cause.
Right, okay, so let's say I decide to get up and make myself some coffee. If that decision is ultimately caused by, like, a bunch of physical stuff happening in my brain, then where does my desire for coffee even fit into that whole causal chain?
Exactly. It seems like the physical events have already got it covered, right? So either our mental properties are just redundant or they're totally irrelevant. And that's the heart of the exclusion problem. If we accept this idea that the physical world is causally closed, meaning that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, then it seems like there's just no room left for mental causes to actually do anything.
But wait, hold on. We talk about mental states causing things all the time, right?
Yeah.
Like, I might say, my fear of spiders made me jump, or, her love of music is why she became a musician. Are we just wrong to talk like that?
Well, that's the puzzle. On the one hand, we have this intuition and even our everyday language that suggests that mental states really do have causal powers. But then, on the other hand, we have this principle of causal closure, which seems to rule out that very possibility. So how do we resolve this tension? Do we have to choose between our intuitions about the mind and our best scientific understanding of the world?
I mean, that doesn't sound like a very happy choice.
Luckily, philosophers have come up with some clever strategies to try and reconcile these seemingly incompatible views. One approach is to say that mental properties aren't actually distinct from physical properties in the first place. This is the identity theory of mind.
Oh, okay. So that view says that my desire for coffee is literally the same thing as some particular brain state.
Exactly. And if that's the case, then there's no problem with them being causally efficacious. After all, no one's arguing that brain states can't cause things to happen.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It certainly seems to simplify things a bit. But doesn't it run into some problems with what's called the multiple realizability of mental states? I mean, if something like pain can be realized by different neural states in, say, humans and cats, and maybe even in some hypothetical alien species, then how can we say that pain is identical to any specific physical state?
That's a sharp observation. The multiple realizability argument has definitely been a challenge for identity theory. But some philosophers have argued that we can still hold on to a version of identity theory by focusing on token identity instead of type identity.
Okay, now you're going to have to remind me what the difference is between tokens and types again.
Of course. A type is just a general category or kind of thing, while a token is a particular instance of that type. So red would be a type, while the specific redness of this apple right here is a token of that type.
Okay, so when we're talking about token identity, we're saying that a particular mental state, like my desire for coffee right now, is identical to some particular brain state. But we're not saying that every single desire for coffee is identical to that same brain state, right?
Exactly. That leaves open the possibility that different physical states in different creatures could all realize the same type of mental state, like pain. So we could have human pain tokens, cat pain tokens, and alien pain tokens, each of which is identical to some particular physical state in that specific creature.
That's a really interesting way to deal with the multiple realizability problem. But I bet there are still some philosophers out there who aren't totally sold on this whole token identity approach.
There are, for sure. One objection is that it kind of makes mental state types seem a bit mysterious. And there's no single physical state that corresponds to, say, pain in general. Then what is it that makes all those different instances of pain, all those pain tokens, actually instances of the same mental state type? What do they have in common?
Yeah, it's like we're lumping together a bunch of different things just because we call them pain, even though they might not actually have anything in common besides the label. It feels a little arbitrary.
That's one way to put it. And it's led some philosophers to move away from identity theory altogether, to explore other ways of fitting mental causation into a physicalist worldview.
Okay, so if mental properties aren't identical to physical properties, then how can they still be causally effective without contradicting this idea of the causal closure of the physical world?
Well, one influential approach is to argue that mental properties get their causal powers from their relationship to physical properties through what's called the supervenience or realization relation.
You know, I vaguely remember supervenience from my metaphysics class, but it was always a little fuzzy for me. Can you refresh my memory on how it works?
Absolutely. The basic idea is that one set of properties supervenes on another set of properties if there can't be any difference in the first set without a corresponding difference in the second set.
So if two things are exactly alike in terms of their physical properties, then they have to be alike in terms of their mental properties as well.
Precisely. And this supervenience relation is often seen as capturing the dependence of the mental on the physical. In other words, mental properties aren't just floating around out there on their own, they're grounded in the physical structure of the world.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this could connect to the problem of mental causation. If mental properties supervene on physical properties, then maybe they can sort of piggyback on the causal powers of those physical properties.
That's the main idea behind a lot of the non-reductive physicalist accounts of mental causation. They argue that mental properties can be causally effective because they're realized by physical properties, and those physical properties are doing the heavy lifting in the causal world.
So it's like mental properties are hitchhiking on the causal power of their physical counterparts.
That's one way to think about it, but it's not just that they're passively tagging along, there's more to it than that.
So there's more to this story than just the mental properties getting a free ride from the physical properties.
For sure. There are different ways to flesh out this inheritance relationship. Some philosophers say that mental properties inherit a weaker or lower grade kind of causal relevance from the physical properties that realize them.
So it's like saying that the physical properties are calling the shots, but the mental properties get to play a supporting role.
That's a decent analogy. They might not be directly causing actions in the same way as their physical realizers, but they still have a kind of borrowed causal relevance.
But that still sounds a little bit like epiphenomenalism, doesn't it? The mental properties are there, but they're not really contributing anything substantial to the causal process.
That's a common concern, definitely. And it's led some philosophers to propose a stronger version of this inheritance solution, one where mental properties actually inherit the full-blown causal efficacy of their physical realizers.
Hold on, wouldn't that just lead us right back to the problem of overdetermination? If both the mental property and its physical realizer have the exact same causal powers, aren't we doubling up on the clauses?
That's a great point, and that's where things get really metaphysically tricky.
Bring on the metaphysics, I say. I'm ready for it.
Okay, so the key move here is to argue that the mental property is somehow immanent in its physical realizer. What that means is the mental property isn't something that exists over and above the physical property. Instead, they're interwoven in a way that basically makes them causally inseparable.
So it's like saying that the mental property is so deeply embedded within the physical property that they're basically two sides of the same coin.
That's a helpful image. They're distinct, but they're inseparable. Like, think of the shape and the weight of a clay sculpture. They're both properties of the same object, and they both contribute to how that object interacts with the world.
So the idea is that whatever the physical property does, the mental property does too, because they're so tightly bound together.
You got it. And that neatly avoids the overdetermination problem because we're not really dealing with two separate causes. It's more like a single cause with two aspects, a physical aspect and a mental aspect.
Man, that's a pretty elegant solution.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are still some skeptics out there who aren't quite convinced. What are some of the objections to this immanence-based approach?
Well, the biggest hurdle is to explain the metaphysics of this immanence relation in a way that's actually clear and convincing. It's easy enough to say that the mental property is immanent in the physical property, but that's just a fancy label unless we can explain what it really means for one property to be immanent in another.
It's like we need to find the right philosophical glue to stick those mental and physical properties together in a way that avoids both epiphenomenalism and overdetermination. Yeah.
That's a good way to think about it. And there's still a lot of debate about which metaphysical framework does the best job of accounting for this immanence relation.
It definitely sounds like there's still plenty of room for philosophical debate on this one. But just when you thought we had covered all the possible angles on the exclusion problem, there's actually another approach that goes in a completely different direction. Instead of trying to find this special relationship between mental and physical properties, it basically just denies that they're even distinct in the first place.
Right, you're talking about the identity solution, right, where
Yeah.
mental properties are literally just physical properties in disguise.
That's the one. But doesn't that kind of go against this whole idea of non-reductive physicalism? Where we insist that mental properties are not the same as physical properties.
It does seem a bit like a contradiction, doesn't it? But remember that multiple realizability argument we talked about earlier, the one that says that mental properties can be realized by many different physical structures.
Oh, right, where we were talking about how pain could be realized differently in humans, cats, and aliens.
Exactly. Well, some philosophers argue that the multiple realizability argument doesn't actually prove that mental and physical properties are different. Instead, it just shows that what we thought was one mental property is actually a whole bunch of different mental properties.
So instead of having one single property of pain that's shared by all creatures, there's human pain, cat pain, and alien pain, each of which is its own thing.
Precisely. And each of these specific pains can then be identified with the particular physical state that realizes it in that creature. So human pain is identical to a certain neural state in humans, cat pain is identical to a certain neural state in cats, and so on.
So it's like we've cut out the middleman and just merged those two categories into one.
Exactly. But this move comes at a cost. It means we have to give up on the idea that mental properties like pain are natural kinds.
So it's a trade-off. We lose a bit of philosophical unity in order to solve the exclusion problem.
That's the trade-off, yeah. But there's actually another version of this identity solution that tries to have it both ways. It uses the distinction between tropes and types.
Okay, now you've really lost me. Tropes and types. Can you walk me through that again?
Sure thing. So picture a specific red apple. The redness of that apple is a trope. It's a specific instance of the property of redness.
So it's not just redness in the abstract, it's the actual redness of that particular apple.
Exactly. Now, the type redness is what unifies all those specific instances of redness, all those red tropes, into a single category.
Okay, I think I'm getting it. So
Yeah.
the type is like the general concept and the tropes are like the concrete instances of that concept.
You got it. And now the identity solution that uses tropes and types says that the mental properties that are causally effective are actually tropes, not types.
So when I talk about, say, the pain that a specific person is experiencing, I'm referring to a pain trope, a particular instance of pain, and not the general concept of pain.
That's right. And that pain trope can be identical with a physical trope, a particular instance of a physical property.
So the pain trope is both mental and physical.
Yeah.
Because it's just one trope that happens to fall under two different types.
Exactly. And that lets us say that there's still this single type of pain that unites all the specific instances of pain. But the type itself isn't causally efficacious. It's those individual pain tropes that are actually doing the work in the causal world.
That's a really clever way to try and hold on to the idea of mental properties as natural kinds while still solving the exclusion problem. But I bet there are still critics of this approach, right?
Oh, of course. Some philosophers worry that we're just pushing the exclusion problem up a level. If a single trope is both mental and physical, wouldn't it have to be causally efficacious only as a physical thing and not as a mental thing?
So we've just shifted the problem from types to tropes.
Yeah, that's the concern. And the debate continues about whether this trope-based identity solution can really escape the exclusion problem after all.
It sounds like philosophers have to make some pretty intricate moves to try and find a place for mental causation within this physicalist view of the world.
Oh, absolutely. And the debates can get very complex and technical. It's a real philosophical deep dive.
Well, I have to say, I'm really enjoying this journey. It's like we're exploring these deep caverns of metaphysics, trying to map out all the hidden connections between the mind and the world.
I love that analogy. And just when you thought we had explored every nook and cranny of the exclusion problem, there's another twist in the story. It involves trying to reconcile mental causation with the idea that the content of our thoughts is partially determined by stuff that's going on outside our heads.
You're talking about externalism, right?
Yeah.
That view that the meaning of our thoughts depends not just on what's going on inside our brains, but also on our relationship to the world around us.
Exactly. Externalism has really shaken things up in philosophy of mind in the past few decades, and it poses some unique challenges for mental causation.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about how externalism complicates the picture.
Well, the thing is, with externalism, it says that part of what determines the content of our thoughts, what our beliefs are actually about, comes from things out in the world, not just stuff happening in our heads. Like, take my belief that water is wet. That's not just some isolated thing happening inside my brain. It's also connected to my past experiences with water and how my language community uses the word water, all that.
Right, so the meaning of a thought isn't just self-contained. It's got these tendrils that reach out into the world.
That's a good way to put it. And that creates a bit of a problem for mental causation because it makes those intentional properties, the aboutness of our thoughts, seem really broad. Like, how can something that depends on factors outside of the mind possibly cause behavior?
It's kind of like saying that the chemical composition of water, which is out there in the world, is what directly causes my brain to form the belief that water is wet. I mean, there's a causal chain there, sure, but it's this long and complicated one with all sorts of mental processes going on in between the external world and my beliefs.
Exactly. And the concern is that somewhere along the way, the actual content of the belief, the aboutness part, gets lost. It's like the content is just a passenger, not the one driving the car.
So it's back to epiphenomenalism again. But this time, it's specifically targeting the causal power of these intentional properties.
That's it. The worry is that the content of our thoughts might be explanatorily useful. It helps us understand why people act the way they do, but it's not actually doing anything in the causal world.
So how do philosophers try to deal with this? How do they square this idea of externalist content with the idea that our thoughts can actually cause us to do things?
There are a few main approaches they've taken. One way is to use the idea of what are called intrinsic causal surrogates.
Intrinsic causal surrogates. Okay, you're going to have to unpack that one for me.
Think of them as like internal stand-ins for those broad externalist contents. So even though the content of my belief might depend on my relationship to, say, water in the world, there's some internal state in my brain, some pattern of neural activity. That's what actually makes me do something like reach for a glass of water when I'm thirsty.
So the brain state is like a proxy for that external content, a way for the content to have some sort of like indirect causal influence.
Exactly. That's the causal surrogate. And because it's a feature of the brain itself, it fits well within a physicalist framework. It's something that can interact causally with other physical states and bring about behavior.
That's pretty clever, I have to admit. But doesn't it just kick the can down the road a bit? I mean, if the internal brain state is doing all the real causal work, then isn't the externalist content still just along for the ride?
That's a valid point, and it's why some philosophers have proposed even more radical solutions. Maybe we need to change how we think about content itself.
Oh, okay, now we're getting to the really deep stuff. Rethinking content. Where do we even start with that?
Well, one idea is to distinguish between two kinds of content: broad content and narrow content. Broad content is the full-blown externalist kind of content, the kind that depends on all those relations to the environment. But narrow content is determined only by what's going on inside the brain state itself.
So narrow content is kind of like a stripped-down version of content, one that doesn't rely on all those external factors.
It's the kind of content that, in theory, could be shared by two people who are in totally different environments as long as their brains are in the same internal state. And the hope is that this narrow content could be identified with that intrinsic causal surrogate, so it could have a more direct role in causing behavior.
So we're looking for a kind of content that can be grounded internally and that can also actually cause things to happen without having to reach out into the world.
That's the idea, but this whole idea of narrow content is pretty controversial.
I can imagine. It's like we're trying to have our cake and eat it too. To have content that's both meaningful and causally powerful without relying on the very things that make it meaningful in the first place.
You've hit the nail on the head. The debate about narrow content can get really complex really fast. Philosophers have different ideas about what narrow content actually is and how it relates to broad content.
That sounds like a topic for a whole other deep dive, honestly.
Totally. But for now, let's move on to another strategy for reconciling externalism with mental causation. This one comes from Fred Dretske, and he focuses on the idea of reasons as structuring causes.
Reasons as structuring causes. Okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more.
So Dretske says we need to think about behavior more broadly. Instead of just focusing on physical movements, we should consider behavior as processes that actually include their mental causes.
So instead of saying that my belief caused my arm to move, we'd say that my belief caused the whole process of my arm moving, which includes both the physical stuff happening in my brain and the content of my belief.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective is really important for how we understand mental causation. It lets those intentional properties, the aboutness of our thoughts, actually play a role in shaping the structure of behavior.
I'm still not quite clear on how that would work in practice. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're thirsty, and you believe there's a glass of water on the table. Gretzky would say that the content of your belief, the fact that it's about water on the table, actually helps to structure the whole process of you reaching for the glass.
So it's not just that the belief kicked off this chain reaction of physical events that led to my arm moving toward the glass. The content of the belief, the fact that I believe there's water there, actually shaped how that whole process unfolded.
Exactly. Your belief with that specific content was part of what caused your reaching behavior because of what it says about the world, because it indicates that there's something there that can satisfy your thirst.
So the content of the belief is doing some real causal work, even though it's not directly causing those muscle contractions in my arm.
Right. It's a subtle but important distinction. Dreske argues that reasons can be these structuring causes. They shape the very processes that make up behavior. And because the content of a belief is central to it being a reason, that gives the content a real causal role.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. It gets at that intuition that the reasons we have for acting really do matter, that they're not just passive observers. But I bet this view has its critics too, right?
Of course. One objection is that it's not clear how those broad externalist contents, those that depend on all these things outside the mind, could actually latch onto those internal processes happening in the brain. I mean, the brain seems to only respond to its own internal states, not to all those far-reaching external factors.
It's kind of like saying that my belief that Paris is the capital of France, which depends on all sorts of historical and geographical stuff, is directly influencing which neurons are firing in my brain right now.
That's the challenge. And it leads some critics to say that Dretske is just pushing the problem back a step. He's still relying on those intrinsic causal surrogates, those internal brain states, to do the actual structuring of behavior. And those surrogates are cut off from the external content by the causal closure of the physical world.
So are we back where we started? Is externalist content always going to be causally irrelevant?
Not so fast. Dreske could argue that even if the surrogates are doing the immediate causal work, that externalist content is still essential in determining which surrogates get activated in the first place. Think about it. If your belief was about something else, like a glass of orange juice instead of water, then a different set of neural processes would have been triggered and you would have done something different.
So it's a kind of indirect causal influence then. The content sets the stage, but those internal brain processes are the actors.
Exactly. But even if we give Dreske that much, there's another objection waiting in the wings.
All right, lay it on me. What's the next hurdle?
This one's about the role of content in ongoing behavior. Dredski's account seems to say that content is only really relevant to what happened in the past, like during the learning process, when those causal processes were being structured. But once those processes are set, the content of my belief doesn't seem to be doing any active causal work anymore. It's like saying that my beliefs about the world shaped how my brain is wired, but once the wiring is done, the content of my beliefs doesn't matter anymore for why I do what I do.
So it's kind of like my belief that touching a hot stove will burn me helped shape my aversion to hot stoves. But once I have that aversion, the content of the belief doesn't matter anymore for why I pull my hand away if I accidentally touch a hot stove.
That's a great analogy. And it gets at a potential issue with Dredski's account. It seems to suggest that content is causally relevant only in a historical way, not in a way that explains what we're doing right now in the present moment.
So where does that leave us?
Hmm.
Have we run out of options for making externalism work with mental causation?
Not quite. There's one more strategy we haven't talked about yet, and it kind of builds on some of the ideas we've already discussed. It's called the broad behavior strategy, and it's similar to that dual explanandum strategy we touched on earlier when we were talking about the exclusion problem.
Okay, remind me how that dual explanandum strategy worked again.
The basic idea is that mental properties and their physical realizers can both be causally relevant to an action, but they're each relevant to a different aspect of the action.
So, like with the example of reaching for water, the physical features of my brain state might cause those specific muscle contractions that make up the reaching movement. But the content of my desire for water is what explains why I'm reaching for water specifically, instead of reaching for, say, a glass of orange juice.
Exactly. We have two different levels of explanation, and each level picks out a different feature of the action. The physical explanation is all about the mechanics of the movement, while the mental explanation is about the intentional content that's guiding the action.
Okay, so how does this dual explanandum strategy help us deal with the problem of externalist content?
Well, the key idea is that when we're talking about whether intentional properties are causally relevant, we're not just interested in explaining bodily movements. We want to explain behavior that we can describe in terms of intentions, behavior that has a certain aboutness to it.
So it's not just about explaining why my arm moved in a particular way. It's about explaining why I reached for the water. We want to explain that action as something intentional, something goal-directed.
Precisely. And once we frame the question in terms of this broader notion of behavior, the connection to externalist content becomes much clearer. What makes my action a reaching for water, as opposed to just some random arm movement, is that it's caused by a desire that's about water, a desire that's been shaped by my experiences with water and my understanding of what water is.
So the broadness of the behavior matches the broadness of the content.
Exactly. The intentional property of the desire is causally relevant to the action as this broad behavior, even though the physical properties of the desire, like its neural realization, might be doing the work at the level of those specific bodily movements.
So both the physical and the mental have their own causal domains, and they each contribute to a different aspect of the action.
That's the idea. The physical properties explain how the action happens, while the mental properties explain why it happens, the reason behind it.
That's a really nice way to bring it all together. It seems to give both externalism and mental causation their proper place. But I imagine there are still some critics of this strategy, right?
You're absolutely right. No philosophical solution is ever completely immune to criticism. One common objection to this approach is that it might be mixing up explanatory relevance with causal relevance.
So just because we can explain why I reached for the water by appealing to my desire for water, that doesn't automatically mean that the content of my desire is playing a direct causal role. It could just be that my brain is doing all the real work, and the content of my desire is just a convenient label that we slap on to describe and explain what's happening.
That's the worry. And it kind of brings us back to that idea of epiphenomenalism again, the idea that mental properties are just along for the ride, not really making anything happen.
So it seems like we've come full circle. We started with the problem of mental causation, and we've ended up right back at the problem of mental causation, but maybe with a more refined and nuanced understanding of it.
That's the nature of philosophy, I think. We dig deeper, we try to clarify the issues, we look at them from different angles. But often the more we learn, the more we realize how much we still don't know.
And I think that's a great place to wrap things up for today. We've covered so much in this deep dive, from the mind-body problem to the causal closure of the physical world, from identity theory to externalism, from narrow content to broad behavior. We might not have found the definitive answer to the problem of mental causation, but we've definitely come away with a better grasp of just how complex this issue really is.
I totally agree. And I hope our listener has come away from this with a deeper appreciation for this enduring philosophical puzzle.
So keep those philosophical gears turning. Keep asking questions, keep exploring these ideas, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to finally solve this philosophical mystery.
Until then, happy philosophizing.